one of the things I wanted to talk with you about too is just in general. Julian Assange is the representative of I think a war against journalists, right? A real investigative journalist. And I'm not talking about stenographers, for the corporate media, but I'm talking about work that you do, work that others do, where you do expose valid war crimes and do present a different narrative through a different lens, rather than just sort of this myopic Western military industrial complex kind of drive. Hopefully we'll get to a point where more independent content creators are lifted and billionaires just don't have a stranglehold on the corporate media. But one of the things that's really been startling has been in the amount of journalists killed, imprisoned, sanctioned, demonetized. And I wanted to talk to you a little bit about Palestine, if you could, because your body of work includes a lot of different subject matter. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. And then I was going to show you the Abby Martin clip when she confronted Blinken.
Secretary Blinken, what about Shireen Abu Akleh? She was murdered by Israeli forces, right? CNN just agreed to this. These are your two greatest allies in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia and Israel. They have murdered American journalists and there have been absolutely no repercussions. And you're sitting up here talking about the freedom of press and democracy. The United States is denying sovereignty to tens of millions of people around the world with draconian sanctions for electing leaders that you do not like. Why is there no accountability for Israel or Saudi Arabia for murdering journalists? It is one of the most dangerous places in the world to be a journalist in Palestine.
I deplore the loss of Shireen. She was a remarkable journalist, an American citizen, as you all know. And there too, we are determined to follow the facts and get to the truth of what happened.
Secretary Blinken, with all due respect.
I'm sorry, with respect, they have not yet been established.
Yes, that has.
No, they have not. We were looking for an independent, credible investigation. When that investigation happens, we will follow the facts wherever they lead. It's as straightforward as that. That has not yet happened, but it's something that we very much want to see happen.
And we'll have time after the panel, of course, to talk more about this.
So, reaction.
Well, Abby Martin is correct that Palestine, historic Palestine, that includes both the state of Israel, right, within the apartheid state, if you like, and also within the occupied Palestinian territories, what's left of historic Palestine, which is also an apartheid system, if you like, is one of the most dangerous places in the world for journalists, both Palestinian and non-Palestinian alike, British, American, including, not that this should matter, but, white, Anglo, middle-class Brits and Americans. Press people, sometimes having press on your shirt and your helmet, as Shireen did, who was wearing both a bulletproof vest, which had press, and she was with a gaggle of other press there at the entrance of Jenin camp, does not always protect you. Sometimes it increases the likelihood that you'll be targeted. So even CNN, as Abby had noted, had their own investigation where they looked at various footage at the time. I mean, originally they went along with the kind of mainstream sort of narrative of, one of them was like ludicrous. What was it? Like, bullet meets journalist, resulting in
found a bullet.
Her passing.
Found a bullet. Yeah.
Yeah. Blinken had said something about it's quite sad about her passing. Isn't passing what happens when you're in bed surrounded by your family, not when your face is blown out because somebody, a sniper,
assassinating
shot you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and where between the space between the vest and the helmet, because she's wearing a helmet, so in that space over there she was shot, right, which is by apparent sniper. So there were no apparent clashes. There were people there sitting, joking, laughing, because she's such a well-known journalist, has been for 25 years. She's known throughout the Middle East as a common face there. As I don't know what would be the equivalent. I don't know that there would be an equivalent in the United States.
Yeah, maybe our older media, like Walter Cronkite, right?
Yeah, or what's that? The female one. The female one.
It's okay.
Sounds very technical, biological. Like I'm an alien. The female one, married to George Stephanopoulos. who was a former White House correspondent. Then he ended up having a thing on CNN. She was
Right.
CNN correspondent for a while,
Okay.
right?
Okay.
So who's
Sort of the face, but yeah, Shireen, like everybody knew who she was. She'd been, really bringing, correct truth about what was going on, and one of the few journalists that were in that area were able to get through.
Yeah. What? I'm sorry. No, that's not.
No,
that's not who I was thinking of. No, although if you type in "married to George Stephanopoulos," I'm sure it'll pop up.
Yeah.
But on average, 2 journalists a year are killed by the state of Israel.
Wow.
Since from 2000 to now, if you were to average it out, between 45 journalists were killed during this time period, according to Palestinian Ministry of Information figures, and 55 according to the Palestinian Journalists Union. So they say it's a bit higher. So Yusuf Abu Hussein was killed in 2021, Ahmed Abu Hussein in 2018, 2014 saw plenty actually. Muhammad Ali Ahmed Al-Kumi, 2012. You have, I don't know if people remember, only last year, the Associated Press building was bombed by the state of Israel in Gaza. They blew it up. They gave people 10 minutes to evacuate. They phoned them up. You've got 10 minutes to evacuate. Then they blew up the entire building. Middle East Eye and also Al Jazeera also used that building.
And there was no international consequences for that. None. Like there was there was a little bit of
can you imagine if it was Russia doing that? I mean, even if it was 10 years ago, we'd be reminded, it would be commemorated every year, right? And if the Russians did something like that, we should be reminded about it. It's just interesting that how quickly it fades from memory, and even just the nature of the wording of the reporting. Like I said, like bullet meets head, bullet and journalists meet, like ships passing in the night.
It just,
So this is, it is one of the most dangerous places in the world to be a journalist. Journalists are regularly targeted. Radio outlets have been bombed. They know, I mean, you have to understand something. The state of Israel has like mapped up practically every alleyway, every building, every corner. They have assets and spies everywhere because they can blackmail people, because the amount, their prison population is quite high, where they just grab people and then imprison them, men, women, children, for days, weeks, months, sometimes years, including journalists. There are at least 10, 15 journalists currently detained in Israel. Not nearly as many as in Turkey, another US ally, NATO partner, engaged in massive ethnic cleansing and literal genocide operations in northern Iraq against Kurds in northern Iraq and northern Syria, which is a whole nother story. But they also have a massive imprisoning of journalists there. I mean, the level of violence by the state of Turkey against journalists and against Kurds and organized labor and leftist groups. And there's a strong relationship between Israel and Turkey going back to their founding, actually. That's a very strong relationship, one of their best sort of partners, as it were. Israel bombed Al-Aqsa TV office in 2014. 45 minutes later, they bombed Al-Aqsa radio office. So it's, that was in Gaza City. So it's not unusual for them to target journalists, and the amount injured is over 1,000, right? So recently. So I think according to one report, they're detaining 11. There's 11 in detention, including, basic rights not being satisfied according to various monitors in terms of abuse and conditions and what have you. So they know what is where. The reason I was talking about their mass surveillance that the Israelis have there. And it's important for people to know that, until recently, the state of Israel didn't exist, right? And the reason why I mention that is because it is a settler colonial state. Now, they didn't invent racism. They didn't invent settler colonialism or ethno-nationalism. Zionism is an ethno-nationalist ideology. In fact, many of its supporters, I've read academic articles saying not all ethno-nationalism is bad, right? Because obviously they're arguing from people should read it to see how these things are how they will try to, basically, if it's Jewish ethno-nationalism in historic Palestine, then apparently it's good, right? Or if it's Azov Battalion, right?
Right. If it's neo-Nazi, it's
if it's literal fascist, like literal fascists, where they have like SS signs on their tanks and on their uniforms, and will they explicitly explicit now? If you tweet something about that, you can end up having your tweet lost.
Well, and you know, I had Ava Bartlett just the other day on the stream live from Ukraine, and she's on a Ukraine military kill list. And she has an American passport and a Canadian passport. She's an international journalist, as you know, and she has been basically, neither government's really helping her. Mainstream media is not covering the story that she's on this kill list. She's in the Ukraine right now on the ground and reporting. And how frightening to not have protection from your own government or support for the truth that you're trying to bring, because she's just simply not reporting State Department talking points, right? She's actually reporting what she's seeing and objective truth. And I think, you know, what's really startling about it is that this kill list isn't just like some, you know, computer website. This was deemed by the US State Department as a terrorist website a few years ago. And 2 to 3 journalists have been killed or disappeared already on that website. So they print her picture, her address, any kind of personal information they can. And it's frightening. She's still doing the work. And I commend you and other journalists that are pushing through, risking your freedom, risking your financial freedom, because they'll put sanctions on you as well in some countries now, including the US. And, you know, trying to just bring truth, right? It's horrible.
It is not a good time for journalists. And I think one of the reasons that matters is because, you know, where do most people get their information from? It's via secondary sources. And so when you have, in some places, fine, they're killed. In other places, they're detained. In other places, a message is sent by, you know, there's the national security bill being pushed through Parliament right now by Priti Patel, no less.
Right. I was going to ask you earlier about the timing of that, because the timing is right during this discussion about whether Assange is extradited or not.
Yes. And also, actually, this first came out during the Snowden and other revelations when David Cameron's government, so previous conservative Tory right-wing government, had ordered a review into the Official Secrets Act laws, right? Because the laws are already pretty draconian, but they're looking at beefing up. I mean, basically, okay, it's under the guise of espionage, like the US Espionage Act, right? So there were some groups breathing a sigh of relief on Twitter. I'd never heard of them, but apparently they're like serious groups. One of them for whistleblowers, and the other called the Freedom of Information Campaign. They're like, oh, we were expecting something much worse that was focusing on journalism, but this just seems to be focusing on espionage. I was like, okay, well, you read, so it basically criminalizes the release, the obtaining the release, unauthorized release or dissemination of any restricted information. So they expand the definition of what you can be prosecuted for, just any restricted information.
Wow.
And then they're like, oh, but so, and the fine, so it's either
it's criminalizing speech. Yeah. Go on.
It's either a fine. I mean, they could say, well, we need to protect against people leaking official documents. And the punishment is either a fine or life in prison. Not a fine up to life in prison, because that's not how it would be worded, right? You have to say, or any sentence between, like, you know, 1 day in prison up to life or what have you. No. So either a judge upon conviction, he or she either gets to fine you or imprison you for life. Those are the two options for the judge. That's as the law is written. Wow. And there's a foreign condition component. So this is only if the foreign power condition is satisfied. That's why these groups had initially said, oh, well, it's fine because there's a foreign power condition. So this is about espionage. But when you read through the foreign power condition, you find that, and I'm going to write a piece about this for Consortium News. Basically, you find that there's many ways for it to be satisfied. If it can be shown or argued before a jury, I suppose, convince a jury that your role in this somehow was with the intent to serve the interests of, or to the benefit of, a foreign power, then they've satisfied the foreign power condition, right? And also, we don't need to name, it says, the state, the prosecutor doesn't need to even identify the foreign power. So, so it's like, okay, well, so you could still get a trial. So, you know, there is no proof. There's nothing to do with espionage then. right? They're just saying if
Right.
you had the intent. So now we get to argue before a jury. Well, look, he's published an RT and he's written articles elsewhere saying NATO is bad and NATO has a role to play in conflict, starting conflict, including Ukraine, that NATO has a role. This sounds like the kind of thing that is written for the benefit of a foreign power. And if you can have like a pretty hysterical environment, you could have a jury saying like, yeah, that does sound like that, especially when they are bombarded of every corner from BBC to the Guardian to the Daily Mail of evil Putin has invaded just because he wants to genocide Ukraine, and that's it, because he wants a new Russian empire, and that's it. There's no alternative, there's no other piece of the puzzle, what have you. So if they satisfy that, and that's deemed to satisfy the foreign power condition, well, now you're facing an unlimited fine or life in prison. So I remember when I read through that, I was like, how can these, like, okay, they seem to have maybe understood a bit more now, because there's an article by a colleague in the Dissenter about this, where there's a better quote than the initial quotes they were putting out on Twitter, right? Because the original quotes on Twitter, and I replied to them, I'm like, have you actually read this? What, there's another one that says, if in part any of the activity alleged was done by a foreign power, then the foreign power condition is satisfied. So it's like, okay, what if the government alleges that the documents that you've published were hacked by the FSB? Okay, should that matter? I mean, look at all the stuff being published about Russia right now.
Right.
I'm sure the CIA has a role in hacking
the biolabs, all of that, the American biolabs.
So when you have stuff, no, but I mean about like emails of government ministry, there's all kinds of Russian government documents being like hacked and dumped. I'm sure the CIA and MI6 and GCHQ and NSA have a role in that. So if I publish some stuff on that, can I be prosecuted in Russia now as a spy using this law? This is the kind of thing as in a version of this law. So what if I publish something in RT and they say, well, RT is partially funded by the Russian state. So therefore, a foreign power is now involved in an element of this offense. So man who works at a government department leaks to me document. I publish document in refer to it in my RT article, or they leak to you. I read your article, I republish on my article what your article says about a leaker who leaked to you. I republish on a website funded by some other foreign state in some way, like the BBC is foreign funded, is British state funded, right? So Al Jazeera is funded by the Qatari government, right? France 24 is funded by the French state, right? And so on and so forth. Telesur by a number of different governments in Latin America. And then you have the Chinese state and the Iranian state and the British, like many governments have channels which are funded. Deutsche Welle, funded in part by the German state. So if I publish an article then in RT critical that reveals, that's based on things that have been leaked even to somebody else, what's to stop the prosecutor then from saying, okay, well, the foreign power condition has been satisfied. There's a foreign power involved. That's the Russian foreign ministry or whatever partially funds RT. And you've been acting then. And they only have to say they knew or ought reasonably to have known that it might be harmful to UK national interests. What does that even mean? Oh, they're removing the element where you actually have to prove harm, merely that it might be harmful to UK national interests.
Oh, that's really key.
So there's all kinds of things
without that element is so key though, because if you don't have to prove harm, that just means a government that doesn't like what you're saying. Basically, so that is criminalizing speech in a way. So
that's like the Espionage Act that being used to prosecute Julian. You don't have to prove harm.
Right.